It's week 9 of 2022. This is Talkin' Science, catching you up on the month's biggest stories with Dr. Brad Tucker. Sanctions on Russia cast down over several multinational space projects, including a direct threat against the space station. The US, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, New Zealand and the United Kingdom sign up to a new space defence pact. And at home, the federal government has committed tens of millions of dollars to building 3 spaceports on home soil with the aim of launching Aussies into orbit.
This is Trekzone's Talkin' Science.
And this is your monthly reminder that Trekzone membership is available via the join button under each video on YouTube or via the trek.zone/support. Plus Trekzone's on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and your favourite podcast feed. Find us, like, follow and subscribe. Brad2 on social media, at btucker22 on Twitter, Dr. Brad Tucker on Facebook. Brad, February has passed us by. I am curious, are we orbiting faster around the sun?
It's all apparent motion.
It absolutely is. We're in March already, and we're doing this monthly Talkin' Science now, so a little bit different, but I certainly am enjoying it. Let's kick off our look back at the last few weeks. Sanctions on Russia following their invasion of Ukraine last week have seen multiple space projects put on hold, possibly indefinitely. Germany has disabled the X-ray telescope eRosetta, currently sitting in Lagrange Point 2. Which is a joint collaboration with Russia. Meanwhile, Russia's space chief threatened the space station in a tweet last week by saying that if cooperation was blocked, he'll save it from an uncontrolled deorbit. And the best response to that was Elon Musk with SpaceX's logo. Just incredible. Plus a handful of other projects as well. Now, NASA did release a statement, Brad, before that tweet from Dmitry Rogozin saying that the partnership for the ISS continues. It does beg the question, though, of where do all these sorts of things stand when the governments aren't happy with each other?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple aspects to it, because what the vague tweet was saying is, well, if you start banning some of the technology sharing, you're putting the space station at risk. And that's not really true, but, trying to spin it that way. There are very limited options, but very real options you could do. There is an American side, essentially, and a Russian side of the space station with equipment duplicated on both sides. They could deorbit one section and just go off. There's a few systems that would be missing, but essentially they could do it. They wouldn't, though. It's just not practical. They could say, hey, well, we're just going to lock our cosmonauts on the Russian side, and so be it. Or the Americans say that it's vice versa. But you also risk them. This is the biggest thing. These people have been working together for years, training, working up there. So they still kind of get on with the job regardless. And they're unlikely to see that conflict in the same way we do on Earth. And this is well known even in the 60s and 70s in the Apollo-Soyuz missions, where they did joint missions together. So you're unlikely to get something like that. The thing is, you're more likely to affect future work. And this is what we're starting to see, is at the jeopardy of either future launches. Russians had just certified and qualified to go up on SpaceX with the Americans. That will no longer happen. Russia was still providing seats to the Americans in the Soyuz capsule. That will no longer happen, plus other missions as well.
It is incredible, and I liken it with my background being in television. I liken it to the news rivalries around our major broadcasters in Channel 7 and Channel 9. Obviously, management have a bit of a thing against each other, but the crews on the ground really don't see that. We're all just TV people, and I guess it's the same a little bit, especially on the space station at the moment, with Americans and Russians living and working side by side. Just getting on with the job, and it really, I'm not going to get into the geopolitics, politics of the situation at the moment, but it very much is, hey, we're just getting on with the job here, and management or the government are doing whatever the government is doing up there. It is an incredible situation, and as you say, unfolding with future missions. Now, Russia isn't part of Artemis, so the future of crewed lunar missions for America and the allies there aren't necessarily in jeopardy. But if NASA, ESA or other space agencies have to start picking up a bigger tab on these future missions, surely there's going to be a knock-on effect that's hard to avoid.
Well, there's things like, well, Russia hasn't agreed to extend the space station beyond 2024. That's probably going to double down now with this view. So someone will have to keep that up. There's bigger things that, there are missions currently scheduled, either joint between Europe and Russia on a Ariane 5, a French rocket, or a Soyuz rocket. Most notably, the biggest one is ExoMars. This is an upcoming Mars rover. Now, this is joint with Europe and Russia. It was scheduled to be launched in July 2020. They missed that window because of COVID lockdown. And Mars launch windows happen every 25, 26 months. So we're coming to one now in a few months' time. I think it's September, October. But it has to be prepared. You have to ship it. So you need 4 or 5 months ahead of time to get ready. So they're rapidly closing on that window because they have ceased cooperation on launches. That has come through now. So if they miss that window, then it is very likely that it would be bumped to the next window, if anything, and that is late 2024, early 2025. So talking about a 5-year delay, partially because of this. So this would have a really big impact on that.
And it's also the astronomical study sides of things as well, not just robotic missions, crewed missions. Losing E. Rosita is a blow, I'm sure. The astronomers on the ground in this joint project just missing out on the ability with the German government shutting down the project. Things are going to go wanting in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, and we'll start to see the effects, over time. Australia participates in the E-Rosetta mission as well through Europe. So obviously we are now cut off from any future data. But again, you still work with your collaborators there. You still have friends. You still have colleagues in every country. So, it will be interesting to see how this affects. I think the biggest thing is, when we look towards the Cold War, or we look back on the Cold War, the U.S. and Russia still did work together on space. We think they didn't. But once the moon race was kind of over, we saw a lot of cooperation between the two agencies that persevered. And in fact, a lot of people quote us saying that was helpful during the turmoil at times here on Earth. Can we regain that, or are we slowly losing that? And it appears to be the latter at this point, which is unfortunate because it has always offered this kind of backdoor way of keeping channels and discussion open and building those relationships. And if that's not the case, then will we ever gain that is a big question.
Certainly one to watch, and another fallout from everything that is going on at the moment. Well, let's move on to the United States, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom signing a joint vision document that calls for greater cooperation to prevent conflicts in space. The Combined Space Operations Vision 2031 outlines cooperation, coordination, and interoperability opportunities to sustain freedom of action in space, optimize resources, enhance mission assurance and resilience, and prevent conflict. That came from the press release, of course. Essentially, a lot of words, Brad, to say that the 7 nations will band together and help everyone avoid fighting in orbit.
Yeah, and it really is this kind of, we're starting to form an alliance isn't quite the right word, but it kind of is a cooperation, a group to uphold the peace and law of space. And this becomes quite big. Most of these countries already participate in defense aspects on the ground. 5 have signed the Artemis Accords. France and Germany have not. They are still helping with the Artemis mission, but there's also some issues between the Moon Treaty and the Artemis Accords. And what it's really trying to establish is we will uphold, practices, use, sustainability in space. And it really is a slight or undertone against the Russia and China-led effort to the moon, because this is really what it's all about, in particular when we get to the moon, and upholding those principles. And as they kind of quote in a quite, I think, scary way, in the instances of armed conflict, this is definitely something that is at the real forefront, which it hasn't been in the past.
Well, we've talked about reliance, everyday reliance on satellites, Brad. This vision specifically addresses that and aims to defend it with military power. As you're saying, getting into this armed conflict stage, certainly an escalation, and the way everything's going at the moment in the last couple of weeks, certainly an escalation on everything. How do you personally feel about peace through power, as it were?
Well, it's interesting because, well, this came out on Thursday morning. We had the Russia anti-satellite missile test that really stirred the hornet's nest with that missile launch. We then had, some issues with Russia and China before. And it's interesting because you go on one saying, hey, we want to uphold the Outer Space Treaty, which is for the peaceful use of space. So how do you reconcile upholding it through militaristic means, a treaty that says no militaristic aspects? And it's also starting to get away from the current vision of, it is not just armed conflict. It is about, how do we interfere with satellites? There's a very important undertone about sustainability in the space junk problem. This is a very interesting one. Again, not just creating more space junk, but how do we monitor it? How do we control it? How do we get rid of it? Something Australia is doing in a big way. So really trying to go into that holistic view of how do we can control space. What I was always interested in, how does this apply to, say, the private corporations and the rise of mega constellations, for instance? How is that going to interfere in the operations and safe use of space when a lot of people quote as saying it poses a risk? So it will be interesting to see how this all plays out, but clearly it is at the thinking of the government from not just a space exploration side.
Well, in an American article on this one, and you just touched on it there as well, they mentioned the Russian anti-satellite missile test back in November last year. That destroyed one of their defunct satellites, caused debris to go flying everywhere, threatened the space station as well. Now, that's one very real threat to the peaceful use of space, as you say. They're not the only country with that capability, though. We'd be remiss in not mentioning China, India, and even the US testing such weapons before. What is the defence against those, putting lasers on the satellites that we want to protect, or some sort of chaff or something like that? Countermeasures?
I mean, there's lots of options. There's changing these deorbiting. There's intercepting the missile before. But I think the point is, you're right. Multiple countries possess this, including one who has led this pact. The U.S. was the first one to do this, by the way. Let's just keep that in mind. But it also then is really thinking about, well, what may happen on the moon as well, and that is becoming in a very big way, where the treaties and laws maybe are even trickier to navigate, and the rules are even trickier to navigate. So I think what we'll start to see is, and this is kind of what they're hinting at, is effort put in building defensive capabilities in this area, again, which is not something that's been the focus. We've been talking about operations, command, technology to better space in a realistic way, but this is purely starting to look at how do we defend in a different way, and that has a lot of different tones and angles from what we're currently doing.
Another one to watch and see what happens, especially with this escalation and the potential for satellites to be knocked out of orbit as part of ongoing operations from Russia. Well, let's move back home, Brad. And this is a good news story to finish up. The federal government has announced a $65 million investment to secure space flights and services right here in Australia.
Yeah, and this is something groups have been really putting an effort in. 5 years ago, and I think we've mentioned this before. Rocket launches weren't a big thing talked about. It was kind of yeah, sure, but really became a hey, this is kind of a big area we can do with 3 lucrative launch sites. Looking, that South Pole access with Whalers Way, the equatorial area with Nullarbor launch sites and Queensland launch sites, and becomes quite exciting in that, quite rightly so, with some investment to fully develop these spaceports. There is a lot of money that can come in, right? These rocket launches really start to build in money from overseas partners, and we've already seen that interest. You then also have just the simple idea, well, then you're employing people in these areas to do technical jobs. You then have the ability to get tourism to these areas, which is really exciting. And groups like Equatorial Launch Australia are working with their traditional owners and to make sure they benefit as well. So, just a huge overall, this isn't just a nice announcement mouthpiece. There's actually really tangible economical benefits by doing something. And I think that's the exciting thing that I see in this area, where these companies have been doing it mostly themselves and working really hard. And now everyone's saying, yeah, all right, let's really prop them up.
Well, when the space agency was first announced, Brad, we talked about whether Aussie astronauts would become a thing, and now it seems they will. We talk about this going from rockets, from contributing to missions to launching our own rockets to now launching our own astronauts as well. Do you think that's a good call?
What they obviously want is to be qualified to launch human space flight. And again, that level of security and safety is very different in terms of just launching satellites. And we see this with NASA, and that's a good thing. Again, big dollars that you could potentially get from some of these companies and some of these groups. We often forget that in terms of astronauts, while we've had two, they had to be American, right? They still had to get American citizenship. But nowadays, we see lots of countries who are flying under their own flag, but getting ride on SpaceX or Soyuz, for instance, in that matter. And for the government to say, hey, well, we need to do this as well. They won't launch from Australia in the first bit. They can launch from, again, SpaceX, but at least they're flying as an Australian astronaut. They're not going to be employed as an American working for NASA. And I think that's a really exciting thing. It's a really important thing when we talk about space and capability. Always been noted, even though it's not high priority, was that inspirational angle that a lot of people want to.
Well, 32.3 million will go to infrastructure, including spaceports, no doubt aiding our friends at Southern Launch Australia, who currently have the only operational port at Whalers Way. Brad, that's on a temporary license. Quite possibly that's going to be extended, and we're going to see more. As you say, we've got Equatorial Launch up in the Northern Territory, and possibly one more as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the good thing is there's a lot of companies and groups saying, hey, we want to do this, and there's good reasons to do it, from the far north to south as well, to access those orbits, and for the government to say, yep, we recognize it, this is important, and it, I think, just goes to that interest from, say, Thai Space that Southern Launch has already had. We all hope that they're successful, and it's nice that, I guess, and just importantly, this is at the forefront. This is no longer just a, hey, yeah, okay, great, let's do it, but this has to be a priority and should be a priority for all of the different reasons for Australia.
Now, with an election on the way, and without picking sides, the facetious side of me comes out, especially since I'm a Labor man. The election is on the way. There's an election in South Australia, hence these promises and these monies are being offered up, if you will. Do you think a Labor government, if they won either in South Australia or federally, will see these investments through? Do you think this is sort of becoming a bit of a bipartisan issue now, where we just want to make this industry happen?
So it is, in fact. Both sides were trying to one-up each other in terms of promises for space, and that was the first real time that you marked that this was an actual issue that they both realized they had to address and fund, and it was a really remarkable shift. And the federal government has pumped a lot of money into space in the past few years. The Moon to Mars initiative. Further funding for the space agency, those sorts of things. So it really has been, hey, yes, this is the both sides. So in fact, I fully expect to see announcements coming as the election gets in from the Labor side of what they will do in the space arena. And it will be, I think, a one-up. Hey, we're going to do this, and we're going to do, or whatever the gives credibility to those overseas groups that we work with. And that's always been the problem with Australia until recently, is if the federal government hadn't taken as seriously as it should, so why should another government work with you when your own government won't support you, kind of view. So there's a lot of credence that goes to when, hey, we are going to go work and support this side. You look at the US, for instance, and when you see various funding for NASA bills, it is actually quite bipartisan. You get huge support from both sides of the aisle because of just what it means and how important it is for both their local jobs in the local district, but also the more broader implications in terms of technology, science, research, defense. So I think we're going to keep seeing that trend here.
Going to be an incredible one, and I am heading to the Space Forum, the Dr. Andy Thomas Foundation Space Forum this week. Certainly a question to be asking of all of those companies that are out there and down there supporting the Aussie space industry. Such an incredible pace and an incredible pace that is being set in Australia as well. Well, Brad, just time for a quick recap of a chat I had recently with Stephanie Millam, the Deputy Project Scientist at the James Webb Space Telescope, which reached Lagrange Point 2 in January and has been spending a few weeks sorting itself out.
I am the Deputy Project Scientist for Planetary Science on the James Webb Space Telescope. What that means is my job was to make sure this extremely sensitive, large space-based telescope that's designed to detect the first stars and galaxies of the universe can actually do things a little bit closer to home. So we want to study objects in our own solar system as well as planets around other stars. This proved to be a little bit challenging, so I was brought on to help make sure that we had enough justification to enable these capabilities, as well as work with the project to make sure that they were actually doing the things that we needed them to do.
Well, that interview is available now with this card on YouTube or by searching for Stephanie on Trekzone. Brad, it's great to pick apart the past few weeks with you. We'll do it again next month.
Thanks.